Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Now, recently I reviewed the Core i5-13600K, and I found it to be an excellent value CPU, probably the best all-rounder you can purchase right now for under $400 US. However, when looking purely at gaming, as I know many of you like to do, the Ryzen 5 7600X is a strong contender, as is the 5800X 3D, the 5600X, and even Intel's own previous generation at 12600K. The problem is, in our day one reviews, we can only look at so many configurations, especially when it comes to memory. So for this content, I've added in sweet spot 3600CL16 memory for the DDR4 configurations, along with a more affordable DDR5 5200 configuration for the 7600X. I'll also be focusing more on affordable motherboards, so I'll be pairing the 5800X 3D and 5600 with a B550 board, a B650 for the 7600X, and even a B660 board for the Intel CPUs. But before we get into the results, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Headphones.com and the new Focal Barties high-end audiophile headphones. These wireless ANC headphones use Focal's highly regarded speaker driver tech, which emphasizes punch and dynamics without sounding bloated or boomy. Vocal clarity and a unique soundstage make these headphones perfect for enjoying your favorite music or movies, especially while on the go. Weighing in at only 350 grams, they're easy to wear for hours at a time, and with exceptional sound clarity to match, they're without question some of the best headphones we've ever used. Check out headphones.com via the link in the video description to find out more. Not only do we have all this new memory testing, but this updated data also includes 4K resolution data, along with the usual 1080p and 1440p results. And this is all, of course, using the GeForce RTX 4090. So you'll get to see how performance scales across those resolutions using various CPU and memory configurations before conducting a detailed cost per frame analysis. So let's quickly go over the test system specifications and then we'll jump into the results. For the Ryzen 5 5600X and Ryzen 7 5800X 3D processors, I'll be using the MSI MPG X570S Carbon Max Wi-Fi motherboard running the latest BIOS. Please note that this data using an X570S motherboard will be representative for all supporting AM4 motherboards. The memory configurations here include 32GB of dual-rank DDR4 3600CL14 and 32GB of single-rank DDR4 3600CL16. Then for the Ryzen 5 7600X, I'm using the MSI Meg X670E Ace motherboard with 32GB of DDR5 6000CL30 and 32GB of DDR5 5200CL40, both single rank. The Core i5 3600K and 12600K each have 3 test configurations, one using expensive high-speed DDR5 6400 CL32 memory on the MSI Z790 Tomahawk DDR5 motherboard, then 2 DDR4 configurations on the MSI Z790 Tomahawk DDR4 using dual-rank DDR4 3600CL14 and single-rank DDR4 3600CL16 memory. Please note that the DDR5 6400 memory used on the Intel platform doesn't work on AM5 as it doesn't offer Expo memory support and loading XMP fails to boot. So the memory has to be manually configured each time, and that's not something most users will be willing to do. Also, it is well worth noting that running DDR5 at 6400 speeds requires a fabric frequency of 2133 MHz, and only the best silicon will achieve that frequency while maintaining stability. So realistically, DDR5 6000 is the limit for Ryzen 7000 series processors, which is why AMD called it the sweet spot, while 13th gen Intel CPUs can go beyond DDR5 6400 with ease. Then finally, the graphics card of choice is the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4090. Also, please note we're using Windows 11 and a resizable bar was enabled for all configurations. Okay, let's get into it. Now, there is a crazy amount of gaming data to go over. I know I often say there's a lot, but this time there is a lot. So we're not going to discuss the results for all 12 games tested, at least not individually, but we'll go over a few of them before taking a look at the geo-mean breakdown, so the average results. Here we see that at 1080p, the 7600X delivered 16% more frames when using DDR5 6000 opposed to 5200, and of course there is quite a substantial difference in memory timings there as well. The 13600K was only tested using a single DDR5 configuration, as the focus here really is on that sweet spot CL16 memory, which was just 2% slower than the ultra expensive CL14 stuff. That said, DDR5 6400 was 22% faster, and that is a massive difference, especially for memory to make. It's also interesting to note that the 12600K saw just a 16% increase from the CL16 3600 to 6400 memory, so the faster 13th gen CPU is doing a better job of justifying the DDR5 memory in this example. Moving on to the 5800X3D, which is the fastest CPU in this test, we saw a reasonable 8% increase in performance from CL14 to CL16 with the 3600 memory, and then we saw an even larger 11% increase when using the 5600X. So the lower latency memory is certainly far more beneficial here for the Ryzen processors than it is for 12th and 13th gen Core i5s. Now, increasing the resolution to 1440p doesn't change that much here. We're still heavily CPU limited in basically all instances, which means frame rates here are very similar to what was shown at 1080p. So that being the case, let's just increase the resolution to 4K. Doing so, we see that the game starts to become more GPU bound, and as a result, CPU and memory performance is less of a concern. Still, the 7600X was 9% faster using DDR5 6000 opposed to 5200, or a rather hefty 22% faster when looking at the 1% lows. And remarkably similar results are seen when looking at the 13600K when going from DDR4 to DDR5, and more importantly, there's virtually no difference between CL14 and CL16 DDR4 memory, and the same is also true when using the 12600K. Moving to the 5800X3D, we see that this CPU is heavily GPU bound, and as a result, memory performance isn't an issue here. And the same is also true when looking at the 5600X, as CL14 only afforded that configuration an extra frame or two. Next, we're going to take a look at Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Extraction, and at 1080p we find some interesting results. Firstly, memory performance doesn't appear to have a significant impact, and some good examples of this are seen when looking at the 7600X and 5600X. The 7600X saw just a 3% improvement when going from 5200 to 6000, while the 5600X saw just a 4% increase when going from CL14 to CL16. Then we see virtually no difference for the Core i5 processors when using either DDR4 or DDR5 memory. Now, increasing the resolution to 1440p reduces most of the margins a bit further, though quite interestingly, the Intel CPUs are now slightly faster using DDR5, though the margins are very slim. Then at 4K, we're almost entirely GPU limited, with just a few small deviations in performance of 2 to 3%. It's also worth noting that we're using the low quality preset here, as this is how gamers typically play Rainbow Six Extraction, as lower quality visuals do provide a competitive advantage. So had higher quality settings been used, we might have seen a stronger GPU bottleneck at the lower resolutions. Moving on to the Far Cry 6 results, and again we'll start with the 1080p data. Here the 7600X enjoys a 10% performance boost using the faster DDR5 memory, while the 13600K delivers similar average frame rate performance regardless of the memory used, though DDR5 did boost 1% lows by 11%. The 5800X3D saw a massive 18% increase to 1% lows when using the lower latency memory, which isn't terribly surprising as Far Cry 6 is very DRAM latency sensitive. Now, increasing the resolution to 1440p once again doesn't change the results all that much. We're still primarily CPU limited here for most of the configurations, so the data is very similar to what was just seen at 1080p. Now, at 4K, a lot of the configurations are starting to become GPU limited, or some of them really are quite heavily GPU limited. The 13600K, 12600K, and 5600X, for example, saw no change in performance between the various memory configurations, while the 5800X3D saw only a 5% change when looking at the 1% lows. Meanwhile, the Ryzen 5 7600X was also just 5% faster using the 6000 memory, so not a big difference here either. Next we have Hitman 3, and in this example, at 1080p, we see that the 7600X is 10% faster using the higher frequency DDR5 memory. Then with the 13600K, we only saw a 2.5% increase from CL16 to CL14, while DDR5 increased performance over CL14 DDR4 by an 8% margin. There was also basically no performance difference between the DDR4 memory kits with the 12600K, while DDR5 was 7% faster. Then we see that performance is much the same with the 5800X3D, while the faster DDR4 memory boosted performance using the 5600X by an 8% margin. The 1440p results are almost unchanged from what was seen at 1080p, so in most instances we are still CPU bound here. Then finally at 4K, we're almost entirely GPU limited, with most configurations finding the GPU limit of just over 190 FPS. That said, these slower memory configurations couldn't quite reach the limits of the RTX 4090, and in fact, the 5600X fell well short at just shy of 160 FPS. Now, I'm going to skip over the F122, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Cyberpunk 2077, the Riftbreaker, CSGO, ACC, Horizon Zero Dawn, and Spider-Man Remastered graphs, as they'll blow the runtime for this video out by an hour or so. Rather, I'll make those graphs available for Floatplane and Patreon members, and instead I'll jump to the 12-game average data, as that's the important information for this comparison, as it will allow us to hone in on the cost per frame, which we'll do in a moment. We've already seen that the 1080p and 1440p data is very similar when using the RTX 4090, as we're almost always CPU bound with the ultra-fast GPU. It's not until we reach the 4K resolution that performance is mostly GPU limited, but even so, looking at the 12-game average, which has been calculated using the GeoMean, we still see that the 7600X was 6% faster using the higher frequency, lower latency DDR5 memory. The 13600K was also 5% faster when using DDR5 6400 opposed to DDR4 3600CL14, though interestingly, the performance for the 5800X 3D and 5600X, which you would expect to be quite CPU bound, the lower latency DDR4 memory just didn't help here. Out of interest, here's a quick look at resolution scaling with the RTX 4090, starting with the Cyberpunk 2077 data. Here the 13600K was slightly faster than the 7600X at 1080p, though the results are close with similar 1% lows and just a 2.5% deviation in the average frame rate. At 1440p, the 7600X was reliably faster, particularly for the 1% lows, which averaged out across all of our runs to be 7% higher. Then at 4K, we ran into a hard GPU limitation, and all three CPU configurations compared here delivered the same results. In Hitman 3, we see that performance at 1080p and 1440p is largely CPU limited, and here the 7600X delivered the best results. However, by the time we reach the 4K resolution, the results have become entirely GPU limited, and now all three CPUs are capped at the same frame rate. The 7600X delivered the best performance in Rainbow Six Extraction at 1080p, improving 1% lows over the 13600K by as much as 21%. That said, those playing at 1440p will see no difference in performance between these three CPUs, and of course, the same is also true at 4K. Though oddly, the 7600X did drop a few frames here, but we're talking about no more than a 2% margin. The last game that we're going to look at resolution scaling in is Watch Dogs Legion, and here the 7600X trailed the 13600K at 1080p and 1440p, while the Core i5 was slower than the 5800X 3D. But again, by the time we hit the 4K resolution, performance levels out as the game becomes entirely GPU bound. And here's a look at the 12-game average across the three resolutions tested. And as you can see, performance overall ends up being much the same for the fastest tested memory configurations for each of these three CPUs. Okay, so this is what we've been working towards, the cost per frame graphs. For this, we're evaluating the entire platform cost, so CPU, motherboard, and memory. The total figure is shown to the left of the graph, and the figure before it are for the memory and motherboard prices. Now, all memory kits are based on 32GB capacities, so the DDR4 3600CL14 memory costs $230, while the CL16 stuff is just $130. The DDR5 5200CL40 memory used with the 7600X costs $150, while the premium DDR5 6000 CL30 stuff that AMD recommends we use, that costs $250. Then the premium DDR5 6400 CL32 memory used with the 13600K and 12600K, that costs $240. Now, the 5600X and 5800X 3D have been priced on a $110 USB 550 board, and there's a few decent models available at that price. Meanwhile, the 7600X, that's been priced on one of the cheaper B650 boards at $170. Then the 12th and 13th gen Core i5s can be paired with a Z690 board with decent DDR4 models starting at $160 or DDR5 at $180. But please note, I will be covering B660 pricing as well, but we'll look at that shortly. So taking all of those prices into account, we get our entire platform cost, which is relevant for those of you upgrading your platform or building a new PC. Based on the 1080p data using the RTX 4090, you're paying a 16% premium for the DDR5 6000 memory over 5200 for the 7600X package. But when accounting for the additional performance that the higher speed memory can deliver, it comes in at a 5% premium, so that's not too bad really. So while the DDR5 5200 memory is certainly better value, I think the premium is worth it for the 6000 stuff in that instance. Now, quite surprisingly, the 13600K is actually slightly worse than the 7600X in terms of value when pairing both with quality DDR5 memory. We're only talking about a mere 5% premium, but it's good to see that the cheaper B650 boards are really helping with the value of AM5. The DDR4 CL14 memory is rather poor value, but that's really always been the case. We use it simply to get the most out of the CPU, at least in terms of out-of-the-box performance. Ideally though, you'd opt for the sweet spot CL16 stuff, and that does drastically reduce the cost, though it does only offer the same level of value as the 7600X running DDR5 5200, so the Ryzen 5 configuration would be my preferred option here. This also means despite costing $40 US less for the CPU, the 12600K simply can't compete with the value of the 13600K or 7600X, so at the current asking price you might as well ignore that 12th gen part. Now, when focusing purely on value, I think the 5800X 3D probably makes the strongest case for itself. Using sweet spot CL16 memory, it came out at a cost of just $2.59 per frame, and overall wasn't much slower than the 13600K and 7600X, yet in terms of price to performance, it was 12% cheaper than the 13600K using the same memory and 16% cheaper than the 7600X using the optimal DDR5 6000 configuration. Also, in terms of value, the 5600X is more affordable again, but performance when CPU bound is considerably lower, so if you're seeking high-end performance, you'll skip over this part for a new build or an upgrade. Now, if we make our cost per frame comparison based on the 4K data, the results are fairly similar, though there are some noteworthy changes. For example, the DDR5 6000 configuration for the 7600X fetched a 5% premium at 1080p, but at 4K that figure has doubled to 10%, making the cheaper 5200 stuff considerably better value, and this trend will continue the more GPU bound the results become, maxing out at 16%. Previously, we found that the 13600K's cost per frame was 11% higher using DDR5 6400 over DDR4 3600CL16, and at 4K that margin grows to 19%, making the DDR4 memory considerably better value, and that margin can only grow as large as 21%. When comparing the 13600K and 7600X head-to-head based on this data, it's pretty easy to make a case for the Ryzen 5 part, given the DDR5 5200 configuration offers similar value to the sweet spot DDR4 configuration of the 13600K. That said, we are pairing the Core i5 processor with a Z690 board, and apparently many of you would consider a cheaper B660 board for this part, so let's take a look at that. Okay. So here I swapped out the Z690 board for a decent B660 model, which costs just $110 US for a DDR4 version, though quite shockingly, you are looking at having to pay $160 US if you want to go DDR5 on a B660 board. I guess there weren't that many DDR5 B660 boards, which also makes sense given how expensive DDR5 used to be. So based on this data, if you're looking for the ultimate in performance while spending less than $800 on the platform, the 7600X using DDR5 6000 memory is probably the way to go, though for the same price, the 13600K did deliver similar performance. I will say that purely for gaming, it doesn't really matter which way you go, but if including core-heavy workload performance, the Core i5 generally smokes the 7600X. The only caveat being B660 boards typically aren't great, and they certainly aren't comparable to B650 when it comes to build quality and features. So I believe the 7600X plus B650 combo is a far better choice than the 13600K on a B660 board. Having said all of that though, if you are more value focused, then the DDR4 version of B660 is hard to beat, coming in at a cost per frame of just $2.70, which is 8% cheaper than the 7600X using DDR5 5200 memory. That said, it's 4% more per frame than the 5800X 3D, which was also faster overall. So in a value-focused scenario, surely the 5800X 3D wins for gaming. The 4K data here isn't drastically different, though the 13600K using CL16 DDR4 does stack up better against the 7600X. The 5800X 3D is also much closer to the 3600K in terms of value, and here the 5600X is much better value than everything else, dropping to just $2.68 per frame, making it almost 20% cheaper than the 5800X 3D and 13600K. So after all of that, it really does depend on a few variables as to which configuration offers you the best value. Personally, I feel for a $320 Core i5 3600K, that sort of CPU is best paired with at least a Z690 motherboard. And if you happen to agree, I think it is hard to ignore the 7600X on a B650 board. In terms of value, you compare the 7600X with DDR5 memory for basically the same price as the 3600K using sweet spot DDR4, but the Ryzen 5 will be faster, and I'm sure that margin will continue to grow as games continue to require more memory bandwidth. Alternatively, if you want to max out your PC with the best memory, right now the 7600X still looks to be the better option for gamers, typically delivering slightly better performance while costing a bit less. This could change once DDR5 7200 and faster memory becomes financially viable, but right now the premium there is pretty crazy. So when looking at this comparison purely through a gaming lens, the 7600X actually looks very good, assuming that B650 pricing is semi-competitive in your region. On that note, should AM5 board prices drop closer to that of AM4, Ryzen 7000 really would become the obvious choice, given the platform advantages and improved efficiency. Though the difference in power consumption isn't that significant when just gaming, especially given the E-cores generally sit around doing stuff all, as they're pretty much useless here. Now, I had expected the sweet spot DDR4 3600 cell 16 memory to really improve the value of the Core i5 13600K, and I guess it did do that, but not to the degree where the 7600X was completely written off. In fact, pairing the 7600X with DDR5 5200 generally seemed like the better option. Moreover, if going with DDR4, the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D is the better gaming CPU, offering greater gaming performance while costing even less. Not only that, but AM4 offers a wide range of motherboards, and B550 is typically better than B660 in terms of features and build quality at the same price point. So if I were trying to get the most gaming performance possible while spending as little as possible, I'd go with the 5800X 3D. Hell, even if you want premium performance, the 5800X 3D is still a viable option, as it matched the 13600K using low latency DDR4, and that was when pairing the Core i5 with DDR5 6400. Based on all of this information, I do find it difficult to recommend the Core i5 13600K for those of you building a new PC or upgrading one, if you're doing so exclusively for gaming. And I do have to emphasize exclusively for gaming. It's just not the best gaming CPU. Rather, you could argue that that honor goes to the Ryzen 5 7600X, but look, truth be told, they are very similar overall, and therefore there's really no clear winner here. It shouldn't matter which one of these CPUs you buy for gaming. Having said that though, I think the 7600X is the better choice for gaming, again, just for gaming. And that's not because it came out ahead in our gaming benchmarks by a very slim margin, but because it is supported by a superior platform that will offer many more CPU upgrade options. Now, you might say, I don't care about this. I'll upgrade my motherboard with my CPU in 3, 4, or 5 years from now. But the point is, when performance and price are virtually identical, you have to look at other factors. And when doing so, the fact is, the 7600X is on a superior platform, it does consume less power, and it is easier to cool despite its love for the 95-degree TJ Maxx. Even if you decide that you want to spend as little as possible on the motherboard, I still feel for gaming the 13600K is a bit of a tough sell. Firstly, in terms of value, DDR5 B660 boards are pretty horrible, so you have to go DDR4, but the value of that combo does beat the 7600X, even when pairing the Ryzen 5 processor with more affordable DDR5 memory. However, it doesn't beat the value of the 5800X 3D on a quality B550 board, and the Ryzen 7 processor is also faster for gaming, so with the AM4 combo costing less and offering more performance, I can't see why you'd opt for the 13600K. Now, all of this might sound very different to my Core i5 13600K review, where I often claimed the Core i5 embarrassed the 7600X. But that review didn't focus exclusively on gaming and instead was an overall comparison of the two CPUs. And as a result, core-heavy productivity comparisons were a serious issue for the 7600X, as the 13600K was often over 40% faster, and that's no small margin. So clearly, if you're looking at performance beyond just gaming, then the 13600K becomes the more obvious choice, thanks to its vastly superior performance. But if just gaming with no plans to tackle core-heavy workloads, then the 7600X is far more appealing, especially given the advantages already mentioned. Still, given AMD's clear weakness right now when it comes to productivity for this particular matchup, they really need to make the 7600X combo just a bit cheaper, and I think if they could do that, then it would become the more obvious choice. Anyway, you should have enough information now to make an informed purchase, though I'd recommend you do wait a few more months as DDR5 and AM5 board pricing should continue to drop, at least a little bit by January. And we might even have some solid info on those Zen 4 3D V-Cache parts, which should be brutally fast for gaming. Anyway, we'll have more information, hopefully around CES on that one. If you enjoyed the video, you know what to do. Subscribe for more content. Also, if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed community member, we do have Floatplane Patreon. Links for those are in the video description. You get access to stuff like our monthly live streams. Tim and I get together and do that. It's a lot of fun. We answer your questions live. We have a Discord chat where we do that in text form pretty much all the time. Behind the scenes content, Q&As, a lot of cool stuff there. So if you're interested, check out our Floatplane or Patreon accounts. As I said, links in the video description. But of course you don't have to. And what I would like to do is thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.